A lot of businessmen came up to ministers and said, why are we anti-China? And say, no, we are not anti-China. It's like asking which eye is more important, unless you're already blind in one. And you do see the international info wars not necessarily targeted at Singapore, but playing out within Singapore. Foreign policy, foreign issues having an impact in domestic politics, whether in Singapore or elsewhere, is not new. Okay? What's new is that the world is much more interconnected. We immediately know what's going on elsewhere, and a huge multiplicity of viewpoints, each catering to narrow segments. And our population is literate. Our population is also very much online, highly connected. So you get both access to information and misinformation. And you do see the international info wars, not necessarily targeted at Singapore, but playing out within Singapore. One example of it is the number of people, even in the last 2 years, since October 2023, we have been picking up, I think we have picked up 6 people under the Internal Security Act who wanted to go off and fight in the Middle East because they have been so influenced. Coming back to the Middle East, in that situation, regardless of your race or language or religion, you're going to be upset about what's happening. And Singapore is upset. But even within Singapore, we can see proportionately, if you're Malay Muslim, you are very much more affected by what's happening, our surveys show, by what's happening in the Middle East compared with the Chinese and the Indians. We have always known that the racial and religious contours of Singapore are such that they can become potential fault lines, which is why the government has always been emphasizing that, we are not arrived at the ideals set out in our pledge. I give you a different example, Ukraine, Russia. When we did surveys, we saw a significant number of the Chinese population, particularly older Chinese, disproportionately compared with other races, taking the view that it was Ukraine which was at fault for the war, and some even believing that Ukraine invaded Russia than the other way around. So you believe based on what your sources of information are, and if you get your information on WeChat, that's the basis on which you come to your conclusions. It tells you that our population, just like any other population in the world, is really going to react to partly out of, based on what they hear, what they read, but often it's also based on religious and racial linkages. Ethnicity, it comes from the gut. These are deep-seated human emotions. They are not going to be diluted significantly by 60 years of nation building. You talk about the problems. What are the antidotes? The antidotes, first, of course, the nation building exercises, the week in, week out, the thousands of events that take place that bring all of our people together. That's why we have been able to hold together. Despite all these stresses of the international system, very often cynicism and the level of cynicism and the willingness to believe in conspiracy theories and international events affecting locally depends on how much trust or lack of trust people have in government. But there is another important part, the means of communication, media, mainstream media. We have always taken the view that, if you take two extremes, one, if you become like the world Pravda, simply repeating whatever the government says, nobody will take you seriously. You have to be credible. On the other hand, you take the extreme Western model where your primary aim is simply to attack the government, because that's how you get eyeballs, then you are not part of the nation building. But if you are an independent, credible, neutral medium for reflecting viewpoints, both what the government says, the opposition says, and what the people say back to the government, and in a large measure, despite the cynicism exhibited by Western media towards us, you have achieved it. And the fact that Singapore media is credible helps tremendously in the way we build trust with the people.
One of the most sort of repeated axioms that frames Singapore's foreign policy is that we will never choose sides. Do you fear that at some point in time it may not even be a question of whether you choose sides? What if you're on nobody's side when the chips fall and you find that you are on nobody's side because you didn't choose sides?
US, China, this is a question that keeps coming up. Actually, the question looks very sensible. Surely you should at some point choose one side. You can't forever be in the middle. I will start out by saying the passive choice is to choose. The activist choice, if the government is activist and thinking about it, is actually to see how we do not have to choose sides, but be friends with both. It's like asking which eye is more important, unless you're already blind in one. Second, from their perspective, US and China, what is Singapore's value proposition? If you're like Indonesia, you have huge amounts of oil and gas and coal and nickel and minerals and so on. It makes sense for them to want a country to be totally aligned to them. But what does Singapore have to offer? Nothing. So our value proposition is actually that of an honest broker. We have a voice. Our voice carries weight in ASEAN. Our voice carries weight in the United Nations. We are the leader of the Forum of Small States. We have a very activist foreign policy. And when Singapore speaks, despite our size, people not necessarily listen, but they pay some regard to what we say. Now, if we become a client state of one or the other, of what value is that to them? People will just stop paying any heed to us. So from their perspective as well, it makes no sense right now for them to ask us to choose. If you look at it from a second perspective, when will they want you to choose? At a time when essentially relations have broken down and they are near to war. Then they will tell everybody, you are either on my side or you're against. But these are two superpowers, mutual assured destruction for themselves and the rest of the world. You have to hope that common sense will prevail and they won't get there. And if they get there, we're all done for anyway. So until then, it's less lazy and more difficult to actually take the activist Singapore foreign policy that we do, which is issue by issue, item by item, deal with both, but have to be nimble and keep thinking about it. There will be issues when we don't see eye to eye with the US, and there will be issues when we don't see eye to eye with China. And on those, the government can either cave in or it can seek to persuade the population. If your sovereignty means something more than just a place in the United Nations and a flag, then an honest government will have to try and persuade the population that, look, on this issue, Singapore's viewpoints and interests are different from China's viewpoints and interests. We had that during TEREX. A lot of businessmen came up to ministers and said, why are we anti-China? I say, no, we are not anti-China. But, sometimes our interests are different. And if the TEREXs are detained in Hong Kong, we have to deal with it. We are Singapore. We are a different country. We are not an appendage of China or the United States or any other country. So that's not an easy task, but if you are clear-eyed, you have to try and continue to do that.